All right, hi everybody. I hope you're doing great out there once again. In this video, I'm going to talk about Plato's Apology. So we segued in our last video to the Apology. So now we're ready to dive in to that text. So we're not going to cover this text cover to cover, but I want to talk about a few of the main themes from the text, and we'll get to those main themes. So we'll do just like a little bit of summary of the text so we're familiar with what's going on in it, and then get to some of the major philosophical points that I want to focus on from it. Okay, so please read the entire apology. You're responsible for doing so. It's required reading, but there'll be a certain focus on certain philosophical topics. Um, but still, I want to go through some of the important setting points too, important summary points from the dialogue. Okay, so Plato's Apology, Socrates on trial. That should make sense now by the time you're watching this video if you've been keeping up with the course material. So let's go to slide 1. So the charges against Socrates, and I've introduced this a brief bit, but I'll say a little bit more now. So the informal charges against Socrates, these are the earlier charges, as the asterisk points out, were studying things in the sky and below the earth, making the weak argument appear stronger, and teaching these things to the youth, or to others. And then we learn that the relevant others would be the youth of Athens. So here we are reading the Apology, and pretty early on, this is page 23, the middle of the first full paragraph, we get a formulation of the informal charges against him. And then we also get them again on page 24 in the second full paragraph, in the middle of the second full paragraph there. Okay, so that's just some textual support places to look for where these informal charges were stated in the text. So again, studying things in the sky and below the earth, making the weak argument appear stronger, and teaching those things to others. Okay, maybe we add to this something like how the informal charges will include Socrates being a wise man who studies things in the sky and below the earth, etc. That bit about being a wise man is not a throwaway, because I think it's trying to capture the fact that he is a philosopher. Okay, so Socrates is identified with a kind of philosopher in ancient Athens. Okay, so that's at least a summary of the informal charges, and in some ways, almost point for point for what you would see in the text. Okay, just maybe presented slightly differently here. Um, Again, these are the earlier charges. I mean, these are the charges that occurred earlier in Socrates' life. Okay, they're more long-standing. They were accusations against Socrates. Accusations against Socrates to people who are now in the jury, but they were accusations against Socrates when these members of the jury were quite young. The members of the jury are going to consist of people who are 30 years or older. So um, these would be people's lives who were in part shaped by the accusations against Socrates. So that's one of the reasons why Socrates, as you know, was more concerned with the earlier informal charges against him. Now, the formal charges, we've discussed these very briefly as well, but just so we remember them and you can see them written out, the formal charges, these are the later charges, involve corrupting the youth, and impiety, believing falsities about the gods. So A and B capture the formal charges against him. So these are the charges that Socrates is criminally accused of. Okay. And if found guilty, very serious sentence penalties would be brought forth. So um, it turns out there's a connection between the charges A and B. The way Socrates corrupts the youth is through his being impious. Okay, his believing falsities about the gods, and falsities about the gods in relation to, Athenian theology, what the Athenians believe about the gods. Okay, so these are the formal charges against Socrates. Um, Now you might wonder what's the connection between the informal and the formal charges, or the earlier and the later charges. Well, they're related to each other. It's not obvious how they are. Let's see if we can work that out to some degree. There's not like a perfect overlap, but there is enough that makes sense for us to say that there's a connection between them. So remember the informal charge of studying things in the sky and below the earth. Well, what does someone do when they study things in the sky and below the earth? Well, let's focus on the things in the sky bit. Where you're studying things like the heavenly bodies, when you're studying the sun and the moon and the stars. Well, many Athenians thought that those were deities or those were divine objects, gods, as it were. So when you're studying these things, you're studying what Athenians believe were gods, and these aren't the kinds of things that that should be understood as objects of scientific or natural study. Okay, so many times philosophers who studied these things were called natural philosophers. They're interested in trying to account for the happenings in the natural world as much as they possibly can in terms of natural causes. This is be contrasted with a worldview that Socrates found himself in, which was dominated by thinking that the natural events have ultimate, at the very least, supernatural causes, right? So um, there's a shipwreck at sea. Odysseus is on his way home, so think about the Odyssey, if that's helpful. There's a storm at sea. What ultimately explains that? Well, Poseidon, right, the god, is unhappy. Okay. There's a war between the Trojans and the Greeks, and you have a winner and loser of various battles within that war. Well, what helps explain winners and losers is what happens with the gods that are participating on either side. Okay, which god gains ascendancy in the battle, something like that. Okay, so supernatural causes for natural events that occur, at least partially. So the natural philosophers, they tried to break away from that in the ancient Greek tradition, try to understand the natural world in purely natural terms as much as they could. So natural events have natural causes. So sometimes this is considered a kind of revolution in human, or at least Western human thinking, whereby we attempt to do something more scientific with our thinking. So we find this in the ancient Greek world. It's called natural philosophy. Um, what we call science used to be called natural philosophy in the tradition until it got started getting called generally science, and then philosophy was its own thing. And then those who practice natural philosophy in Socrates' day, we're thinking here about the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, you were accused of being atheists and thus impious. So why would that be? Because if you're going to claim that the sun is something that could be studied like any other object can be studied, then you're basically taking away the divinity of the sun, which is the sun should be Apollo, right? The god. So that's the accusation here. So if you study things in the sky and below the earth, um, then you're a natural philosopher. If you're a natural philosopher, you're open to the atheism impiety charge. Okay, so think about the first charge is, or the second charge against Socrates. It's the second formal charge, excuse me. It's Socrates doesn't believe in the Athenian gods. He's impious. And it turns out that in the dialogue, when Socrates cross-examines the lead prosecutor against him, the lead witness against him, Meletus, he gets accused of atheism. So Socrates is being confused with being a natural philosopher, as it turns out, as we'll see. Now, the second informal charge was making the weaker argument stronger. Technically, nothing like illegal about doing this, but doing so would make you a suspicious character. So there were those who went around the ancient Greek city-states, and um, they taught people how to speak publicly, to speak persuasively in public, and one of the reasons why they did this was because there was a bit of a demand for um, debating on the public stage, in the public arena, as some of the ancient Greek city-states experimented with democracy, and open debate in public arena was encouraged, at least between some members of the community. So there was a kind of proto-democracy where the democracy applied really only to a small subset of the population at large. And we've seen over time that democracies have developed in more universal ways. Definitely not perfectly, but definitely better than the way things were in the ancient Athenian world, in the ancient Greek city-state world. So the sophists gained a reputation for helping people become persuasive, not necessarily make good arguments. So the sophists are oftentimes connected with teaching rhetoric, teaching people how to be rhetorically effective in conversation as opposed to being truth tellers. And the people here are called sophists. So these are these quote unquote teachers who go around helping people become more persuasive. They charged a lot of money teaching this form of persuasion. Sometimes it's called kind of the logic of rhetoric that they taught us, suppose the logic of truth. Okay, and Socrates is getting confused in these informal charges with being a sophist, or at least he's being accused of being a sophist. Plato, many of Socrates, in many of his works, is at pains to show that Socrates is distinct from sophists. Okay, in fact, Plato he seems quite clearly to paint a target on sophists and have Socrates argue with them in many of the dialogues. And some of the dialogues are even named after sophists, sophist figures. So this isn't technically illegal. It wasn't illegal to be a sophist, but you were looked at with suspicion, at least by many, if you were a sophist. And then the third informal charge is teaching these things to others. Well, that was teaching things to the youth. And that's where the first formal charge comes from, at least as we've identified it as corrupting the youth. So we see a connection, especially with 1 and 3 of the earlier to the later charges. 2 just helps in a way kind of sully Socrates' reputation in as much as he's claimed to be a sophist, someone who is interested in rhetoric and not truth. If you've read the first few pages of the dialogue, which I hope you have, you know that Socrates is pretty clear early on that that he's not interested in rhetoric. He's interested in sort of plain speaking, getting after the truth. Okay, in many places in Plato's dialogues, he has the sophist seem like they speak so beautifully that that even true seekers could be misled by them to think that, wow, what they're saying must be. So we have to kind of guard ourselves against flowery uses of language or persuasive uses of language as opposed to just plain speaking, getting after what's true. Okay, so that's connecting the earlier and the later charges. I promised I would do that at the end of my last video. So let's move on to Socrates' defense and just give kind of a brief summary of what's going on with the various stages of defense. So I identify 4 stages of defense. I've told you those, I think, very briefly, but I'll say a bit more now that we're there. So stage 1 is defense by explanation, the human wisdom story. So here Socrates wishes to take on the informal charges or informal accusations against him. Okay, so stage 1 is all informal charges against him. And then, as I see it, stage 2 is going after the formal, and then 3 and 4, or 3 is going after perhaps both of them. It's not explicit in the text. And the 4th one is just a kind of different nature of defense, and we'll come to that. So again, stage 1 is related to the informal accusations. So we have here defense by explanation, the human wisdom story. I've got a PDF around here. Oh yeah, here it is. This might be helpful for you. So here I call it the human wisdom story because on page 25, Socrates, he's trying to explain where the charges come from initially by talking about how his reputation was caused by a certain kind of wisdom. What kind of wisdom? Human wisdom. Okay, so this is the last paragraph on page 25, which carries over to page 26, middle of the paragraph there. So that's where I get the human wisdom story idea. And then here's some apology moves that might be helpful. Just use this PDF to guide us here. So stage 1, defense by explanation. You know, I wanted to try to give you some summarizing points here. I'll let you read the text and help, and this should help you with organizing the text yourself. But the slanderous accusations against Socrates were simply default accusations, it turned out, leveled against him. The same accusations leveled against any philosopher, setting things in the sky and below the earth, making the weak argument stronger, teaching these things to others, namely the youth. So the thought is that Socrates thinks that if you see where the accusations against him come from, namely these default accusations against him, then you'll see that they're wrong, because Socrates wasn't a natural philosopher. He wasn't a sophist. And he did teach things to others, but he didn't teach sophism or naturalism to the youth. Okay. So that's, big picture way of understanding the defense by explanation. But the um, um, the the basic story here that leads up to the default accusation point is that Socrates' friend goes to an oracle, a godlike being, and asks if there's anybody who's wiser than Socrates. Socrates has been gaining a reputation for being wise. Is anyone wiser than Socrates? The oracle says no. And so Socrates' friend goes back to Socrates and says, hey, there's no one wiser than you. And Socrates is like, well, that can't be, because I'm not wise, or I'm not very wise. So he sets out to try to interpret what the oracle means. Maybe the oracle was just joking, so the oracle probably wasn't speaking literally true, he thinks. So he goes around trying to see if there's anybody wiser than he, to see if there was some like non-literal interpretation of what the oracle meant. Well, it turns out that Socrates discovers, as he systematically goes around talking to poets, politicians, and craftspeople, politicians, poets, and craftspeople in that order, he finds out that each of these groups claims that they have the relevant philosophical wisdom, but in fact they don't. And only Socrates is one who's aware of the fact that he doesn't have that wisdom. And that alone is what makes Socrates wiser than people in these groups. So that Socrates does this, he ends up getting youth who follow him around, because the youth like to see people argue and debate with each other, and they like to see Socrates take down these people in terms of what they claim to know. So they claim to be so wise, but Socrates kind of brings them down to size, and so so then they try to imitate Socrates, and all they end up doing is making fools of themselves around their parents and other adults. And so other adults are like, what's going on? So the adults, excuse me, are wondering, like, what's going on with our youth? And they point to Socrates and say that Socrates is corrupting them. How is Socrates corrupting them? Well, he's corrupting them by teaching them natural philosophy, right, which is a kind of atheism, teaching them natural philosophy, and he's teaching him sophism, teaching him what the sophists teach, teaching him how to be rhetorical, teaching him the logic of rhetoric as opposed to the logic of truth, right? And so Socrates claims that, well, those are just default accusations against anybody who's a philosopher. And he's going to say, I'm not that. I'm not any of those things. Okay. So that's the basis of the defense by explanation in the human wisdom story. At the end of the day, Socrates ends up claiming that human wisdom is very insignificant. Human wisdom, being among those who are the wisest, really just means being such that one is aware of the fact, or one knows that they don't have the relevant wisdom, relevant philosophical wisdom. And Socrates himself seems to suggest, and I think quite explicitly says, that it's the gods who have the relevant wisdom, and humans don't have it. Okay, so that's stage one. Stage two is the defense by cross-examination here. And again, I'll just give you some of the key moves that are made here. So this this part of the defense is Socrates taking on Meletus to show that he's unreliable. So Socrates attempts to show that he's not guilty of the formal charges against him indirectly, by attempting to cast out on Meletus's reliability as a witness. So it's classic cross-examination. But also what's going on here, Socrates ends up having the right to explore what the charges exactly are against him. So we have these formal charges against him. What do they amount to? Okay. And again, I want you to read this section carefully. I'm going to give you a summary, but I want you to see if you can work out more of the details. So so 2B in Meletus. So let me actually, before I say get to B, 2B, let me just say that Socrates deals with the the two charges against him, but he develops three arguments: two against the first charge, the corruption of the youth charge, and then one against the impiety charge. Okay, and he thinks that that by running these three arguments, he'll be able to show that that Meletus is an unreliable witness. So that's the strategy. So B and C will be focused on Socrates' challenge to the corruption charge, and D will deal with the impiety charge, which becomes an atheism charge. So B, Melius, 2B, Melius doesn't care about the education of the youth and their well-being as he claims to. Socrates claims it would be great if Melius did care about the youth. This is seen by the fact that Melius' claim that everyone but Socrates contributes to the excellence of the Athenian youth conflicts with the very clear truth that very few people contribute to the excellence of the youth. As he says, as Socrates says, is seen in the analogous case of horse breeding or animal breeding more generally. Okay. So the idea there is supposed to be that when it comes to horse breeding or animal breeding, it's really the few who are the experts who improve the animals. Well, likewise, it should also be the case that when it comes to raising humans, lots of difference between raising animals and humans, but we can make them better or worse. And that's what connects them analogously for Socrates. Um, we it should also be the case that it's the few who improve the youth and the many who don't improve them or corrupt them. Uh, so in any case, Melius hadn't thought about these issues enough for Socrates to then claim, well, you're unreliable and not caring about the youth in the way that you claim. Okay, so the horse breeding point is sometimes very tricky for students, but hopefully what I just said will help out with those passages. It goes kind of quick in the text too, so I think the key is understanding the presupposed analogous connection between horse breeding or raising animals and raising humans. Despite the many differences they may have, they do share some things in common. And in particular, they have in common the fact that that which is raised or those whom are raised can be either benefited or improved or harmed by those who are raising them. All right, so that's the first argument against the first charge. The second argument against the first charge is captured in 2C, where Socrates tries to bring out Meletus's unreliability by saying that he brings Socrates to court irresponsibly, by failing to realize that if Socrates willingly corrupted the youth, he would also have willingly brought harm on himself, which Meletus and Socrates claim is impossible. So Socrates gets Meletus to accept the idea that nobody willingly brings harm on themselves, but Socrates would have to willingly bring harm on himself if he intentionally or willfully corrupted the youth. Moreover, Socrates doesn't belong in the court if he corrupted the youth unwillingly, which is the only other option. So Meletus contradicts himself if he says that Socrates willingly corrupted the youth. And then the only other option would be that Socrates didn't do so willingly, but then he shouldn't be brought to court. He should be, privately corrected. Okay. So there's no legal requirement to bring someone to court if they are unwillingly doing the relevant wrong. So those are the two arguments then against the first charge. Now the one and only argument against the second charge, the impiety charge, is that Meletus, he deals frivolously with serious matters, namely religious matters. So he accuses Socrates of atheism. So when Socrates says, "What do you mean that I don't believe in the Athenian gods? Do you mean that I'm just a heretic and I believe in other things about the gods? Or do you mean that that I just don't believe in the gods at all?" Well, Meletus says, "You don't believe in the gods at all." And Socrates is like, "This is crazy. You must have me confused with another philosopher, a natural philosopher who in the text is identified as Anaxagoras, okay, who is a naturalist philosopher, who was a naturalist philosopher. And we know some things about him. And if you were to take a pre-Socratic course or an ancient Greek philosophy course here, in particular, you would study some Anaxagoras likely. Okay, so Meletus's very sworn deposition, though, implies that Socrates does believe in the gods. He ridicules Socrates for claiming that there is this personal God, this is the word's called daemon, that guides him in his life. So he can't at one and the same time claim that Socrates is an atheist, meaning he doesn't believe that they're gods, when he ridicules Socrates for believing in this personal God that guides him. So he can't be an atheist. Okay, so sometimes a lot of time is spent when people analyze and discuss the apology. We spend a lot of time on the cross-examination. I'm going to be kind of quick on it. I think there's interesting things that are going on there, but there's more interesting things elsewhere too. So I want to focus on those. Hopefully the discussion here is clear. If not, let me know how I can help. I know I'm being kind of quick with the discussion here. I'll turn to the text because I know I want you to read it, and I want you to as well. I want to show you where the The cross-examination begins here on page 28. And we get the statement of the charges, the corruption charge and the impiety charge. And then he deals with them point by point. Socrates then goes on to say that he's going to show that Meletus is unreliable in three different ways, I think captured by the three different arguments that we see. It turns out in reverse order that you see the presentation there, but still, that's what happens. We get the first argument running to here, running to the top of page 30, and then you get the second argument, and then we get to the third argument here, the challenge to his cross-examination with respect to the impiety atheism charge on bottom of page 30. Okay. Okay, and then by the bottom of page 32, last full paragraph, Socrates is like, I've done what I needed to discharge and respond adequately to the formal charges against me. Okay. Still, I think he's concerned that the early accusations against him make his testimony against Meletus, all right, and unlikely by okay. So that then gets us to the real Socrates, which I really kind of build off of the discussion here, bottom of page 32, where Socrates considers hypothetical jury person, claiming something like, well, Socrates must have done something wrong to have put himself in this position. Even if he's not guilty of the formal charges against him, he must have lived a shameful life. And Socrates is like, well, you're wrong in assuming that just because I'm here with my life at risk that I must have lived shamefully, because if you claim that, then you're also claiming that Achilles, right, the famous Greek hero, is also shameful because he lived his life in such a way that he put his life at risk. And on top of page 33 here, Socrates gives the Achilles example as a way of showing that you can live a courageous life even if you have put your life at risk, by saying that, like, when someone has killed a friend of yours, like someone like Hector killed Patroclus, who was Achilles' great friend, Achilles would put himself at risk by going to kill Hector in revenge. So if you've seen Troy, you know how this plays out. If you haven't seen Troy, well, check it out. You might find you might understand what's going on here in this passage a bit better. But it was sort of a great move by Socrates, because Achilles is a terrific hero for the ancient Greeks, and the jury would really recognize this example. So moreover, he also appeals to other Greek heroes who died in the Greek Trojan War, Greek versus the Trojan War, where the Greeks fought the Trojans, or Greece was fighting Troy. Well, of course, when the Greek heroes went to battle, they put their lives in danger as well. Okay. So then from here, Socrates has to say that he's relevantly like the Greek heroes, relevantly like Achilles, even though he doesn't have to claim that he's as amazing as they are. And he goes on to say, like, look, I put my life at risk by fighting in all of these battles, Potidea, Amphipolis, and Delium, right? He risked his life in danger, and he didn't flee. Okay, so he didn't live shamefully either. He lived courageously. So he put his life in danger in his life at risk in his own life, and wasn't thereby living shamefully. He was actually living courageously. And then he goes on to say, look, just under that, he goes on to say, I also put my life at risk by practicing philosophy, and I was ordered to practice philosophy by the gods. And so I put my life at risk because now my life's at risk because I practice philosophy, and I'm not living shamefully. So, like, what did I do in my life to put myself in this position? Well, I started practicing philosophy and put me in this position that I'm now in. But just as before, I put my life at risk in as being part of the Athenian military. I wasn't shameful. I was actually courageous. So then the same thing could be said about my practicing philosophy, my life being at risk. So Socrates is saying that he's not fleeing from what he's commanded to do by his superiors, whether they're military, earthly, or godly. The command comes from a god, as he claims here. He's claiming that the gods commanded him, ordered him to practice philosophy. Okay. So the real Socrates is coming out here. He's someone who is actually heroic, who follows the commands of his superiors, be they a military commander or a god. Okay. And then we learn like a bit more. Well, what's the nature of the command? Well, the nature of the command is found top of page 34, and that's to get and really down. So starts at top of page 34, and then you learn what Socrates is, what the command, what the god commanded Socrates to do by continuing reading 34, and you see that it's to get people to care about virtue. Okay, to get people to prioritize what's valuable, what's most valuable. And then stage 4 is the defense of Athens against itself. So after we get a sense of who he was, page 35, really middle of the page roughly, and on, he goes on to say that he's defending Athens against itself because it's about to kill an innocent man. Okay, he says this is the paragraph that carries over from page 34. He says, I think he is doing himself much greater harm what he's doing now, attempting to have a man executed unjustly. He says, indeed, men of Athens, I'm far from making defense now on my own behalf, as might be thought, but on yours, to prevent you from wrongdoing by mistreating the gods gift you by condemning me. Okay. So we go back to our moves sheet here, the real Socrates, just so we can recap the points. 3A, the third stage of defense. A, Socrates' response to the objection that he must have lived shamefully by living a life in such a way that he put his life at risk in 2 steps. First, he argues that it's false to assume one lives shamefully by putting one's life in danger, right? There, he just used a precedence case. He uses Achilles and other Greek heroes at Troy. And second, he argues that, like Achilles and other Greek heroes, he acted honorably by doing what is right, even though he put his life in danger by doing so. Okay. And then B, Socrates' response to the possibility of a conditional acquittal. So Plato creates the conversational possibility, right, for Socrates, or that creates the conversational, the speech possibility for Socrates to state what the gods ordered him to do by having Socrates consider the possibility of a conditional acquittal. Okay. And if you're looking for that in the text, that's the top of page 34. Okay. So the conditional acquittal would basically maintain that if that's why it's called conditional, if Socrates were to cease practicing philosophy, then he'd be acquitted. Well, Socrates says that he would never cease practicing philosophy. He would die many times over. So if that were the case, because he's that committed to following what the god commands him to do. Socrates ends up claiming it in the 3A section, that one could have called him impious, and the formal charges could have held against him, if you will, had he at once in his life followed the military commander, and then later in his life not followed what the gods commanded him to do, because his life was at risk. Okay, but he said that's not what he did. Okay, he believed in the gods, he trusts the gods, and does what they command him to do, even if that means that he's in dangerous, life's at risk, etc. Okay, and then the stage 4 defense, the table turning move, as I sometimes call it, 4A here. Socrates ceases defending himself for the sake of defending Athens. Socrates senses that Athens is about to try to kill a person unjustly, to kill an innocent person, which is a true harm. Socrates makes a surprising claim that neither Miletus nor Anytus nor Lycan can harm him, even if they were to banish or kill him. And we'll get to that point a bit later. Okay. So it's a bit of surprising claim. You might think that one of the most of your ways you could be harmed is to be killed, for example. Okay, so that's a brief summary of the sages of Socrates' defense. There's a lot more detail in the text, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of the text, and hopefully that helps you with understanding as you read through it. Now, the verdict in Socrates' sentence, well, a jury of 501 people found Socrates guilty. He lost by, I think, about 60 votes, if I remember from the text accurately here. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. Let me know. So it may have been a closer vote than many were expecting, than maybe Socrates was even expecting. And then he was sentenced to death. Okay, Socrates had a say, at least in terms of being able to offer a proposal for what his sentence should have been, and he said something like, "Well, either a small fine or a large one." But he has friends with money, so that wasn't really a problem for him. He actually kind of in a tongue-in-cheek kind of Socratic irony way, I think, which I developed last time, said that, well, his penalty, quote unquote penalty, should be to be rewarded and given free meals for the rest of his days at Prytaneum, where Olympic heroes are fed. Okay, imagine the jury didn't like hearing that. If you're interested in more on Socrates's, what happens to Socrates, um, 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 like as he's like his last day, interested more about his death, you could check out Plato's Phaedo in the 5 dialogues. I don't have it in the PDF that I provided you, but you could always likely find a free source of the Phaedo online. And that's a jailhouse classic Plato wrote that captures Socrates' last day. Okay, he drinks hemlock. So in a way, Athens forced Socrates to commit suicide. Okay, there's another work in the text that I actually provided you. It's called the Crito, and that's Socrates' time in prison, where his friend Crito comes to him and tries to convince him to break out of the Athenian prison he's in to flee elsewhere. And I'll say a bit more about that when we get to the Meno. So moving on, I want to just now talk about a few themes from Plato's Apology, a few of the main philosophical themes of interest for us. So one, Socrates' philosophical mission, which we've already touched on briefly. Socrates' theory of the good, or the good life, sometimes it's put. Socrates on the unexamined life, and Socrates' theory of death. Okay, we're going to talk about Epicurus' theory of death when we get there, so that's one of the reasons why I'm touching on Socrates' theory of death. So let's just go through these one by one. This won't take too long. I just want to give you, again, a sense of what's going on and encourage you to allow this video to help out with understanding the text. So Socrates' philosophical mission, we know it's God commanded. So it's a kind of like religious philosophical mission. I don't think that for Socrates there's a strict division or distinction between philosophy and religion. Okay. I think that it's sometimes overstated based on what Plato says in the Euthyphro about piety and perhaps morality being in some sense independent of the gods, that some have claimed that Plato and Socrates thought that religion and philosophy were separate from each other. But I don't think that's the case at all. I just think that the way in which philosophy is separate, or the way in which like ethics or the way in which morality and piety are distinct or independent from the gods, has to do with the gods loving the thing in question as determining or making piety or morality. Okay, and I could talk more about that if you're interested in that topic, but I do think that Socrates' mission is a religious one. He's quite explicit about it. It's God commanded. He follows what the gods command him to do as a true believer. So Socrates saying that the God ordered him to take up philosophy. Remember, he's willing to take that to his death. Okay, he's willing to die for what the gods command him to do. Okay, so in a way, like it's kind of interesting. You read the Euthyphro where you get an analysis or an attempted analysis at what piety is. Um, um, we know in the end we end up with aporia, right? But then you read about Socrates' life in the Apology, and you see a pious life. Okay, at least by hypothesis you do. I don't think it's a stretch to say that you see a pious life, but again, that'd be an example of a pious life. But what does it mean to live a pious life? We could still then ask the question of Euthyphro. Okay, but it's nice to see, sort of be given an example. Socrates is someone who is known for having lived an exemplary life, at least for many. Many people um, might disagree with that, but there are many in the tradition as well who think that Socrates is worth emulating in various ways. We know that's also virtue-centered. So Socrates claimed that the gods ordered Socrates to get people to focus on what truly matters, and that's living a virtuous life. Okay, so the passage from the Euthyphros, really good here. This is where the conditional acquittal possibility occurs. Again, legally, that probably wasn't even an option in ancient Athens, but Socrates considers it. I think Plato has Socrates consider it in order to keep the dialogue going and give some textual way of establishing what the god ordered him to do. And he says, men of Athens, I'm grateful. Hopefully you can see where I'm reading from here, where my cursor's at. Men of Athens, I'm grateful, and I'm your friend. In some translations, and I love you, but I will obey the God rather than you. And as long as I draw breath and am able, I shall not cease to practice philosophy, to exhort you, and in my usual way to point out to any one of you whom I happen to meet, good sir, you're an Athenian, a citizen of the greatest city with the greatest reputation for both wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed of your eagerness to possess as much wealth, reputation, and honors as possible, while you do not care for nor give thought to wisdom or truth, or the best possible state of your soul? Then if one of you disputes this and says he does care, I shall not let him go at once or leave him, but I shall question him, examine him, and test him. And if I do not think that he has attained the goodness that he says he has, so if the person claims that they're interested in the truth, that they claim that they're interested in wisdom and the health of their soul and the excellence of their soul, if they're not honest about that, then Socrates says he will approach him because he attaches little importance to those important things and greater importance to the inferior things. So he values less the things that are truly valuable than the things that are less valuable. I shall treat in this way anyone I happen to meet, young and old, citizen and stranger, and more so to the citizens, because you are more kindred to me, like the fellow Athenians are closer to him. Be sure that this is what the God orders me to do. Okay, and then he goes on to say, this is all I'm doing, okay, is getting people to care about Athens in line, to care about virtue in line with what the God has commanded me to do. What does it mean to care about virtue? To care about wisdom, truth, the best possible state of your soul, having an excellent soul. And he goes on to say, wealth does not bring about excellence. Wealth does not bring about virtue, a healthy soul. But virtue or a healthy soul makes wealth and everything else good for men, both individually and collectively. Okay, so in a way, doesn't Socrates capture something significant to what many of us believe in the Western tradition? We value, of course, our reputation, worldly success, having financial means, security, and things like that. Even things related to how we look and the like. But we don't care for them, do we? At least in our finer moments, more than we don't care for them in the same way that we care about having excellent souls, right? You know, like our ideal selves or more ideal selves, or when we're carefully prioritizing like what we value, we're going to put being a good person over and above having a lot of money, over and above having a strong reputation. Okay, like being truly good as a person is what it means to be virtuous. Think about it, and to care about things like truth. Um, we think, don't we? At least many of us, maybe most of us, more important than how much money we have in our bank account. Okay, so Socrates here is putting emphasis on virtue. He, the term that's used in our translation is excellence, excellence of soul. You understand that as in terms of being like an excellent person, a good person, an exemplary person, which I'm guessing upon reflection we would all think is one of the most important things that we could possibly do, if not the most important thing that we could do, is focus on just being good people. Okay, going back to our presentation here, and it's proof Socrates claims that he's lacked care for his external well-being. Okay, no one in their right mind would give up the lack of care for one's external well-being, like where they're going to get food, how much money they're going to make, whether they have proper clothing, and the rest. Socrates is like, he's like, look, I'm ragamuffin. My friends give me bits of food to eat from time to time to hold me over. Um, I don't concern myself with these matters. I concern myself with what the God commanded me to do. So just want to look at him, people would be able to say, okay, he looks impoverished. Okay, he looks um, he looks like he doesn't care for his external well-being, but he deeply cares about virtue and doing what the God commanded him to do. Okay, at least that's the ways Plato portraits Socrates often. Okay, so that's one, right? Going back to Socrates' philosophical mission, then Socrates' theory of the good. Whoops, Socrates. Socrates is part of a long-standing tradition that has focused on what makes a life a good one, what makes um, um, a person's life go well for them in terms of their well-being. Um, those might not mean the same exact things depending on the context here, but here we can understand like living a good life is one where one has a lot of well-being, okay, where one is living a good life for them. This is a central issue in ethics, and one that, at the very least, Socrates is a part of, if not to be recognized for inaugurating as having this central significance. Again, at least in the Western tradition, the one that emanates from the ancient Greek world. Philosophers answer this question or answer this issue. So the question here is like, what makes a life a good one? Okay, so philosophers answer this question, the question I just noted, by providing a theory of goodness, and a particular theory of like what's good for us. Okay, and there can be perfect overlap between the two. There's like a theory of what's good, full stop, versus a theory of what's good for us, and those two just might be the same thing. So the focus is on what's essentially, or so as we sometimes put it nowadays, intrinsically good for us. Like what is good by its very nature for us? Or what are like the basic or fundamental things that contribute to our lives going well for us, such that we're living a good human life? Okay. And on Socrates' view, it's virtue. Surprise, surprise, that is central to living a good life. In fact, it is the one thing that's intrinsically good. It's the one thing that makes other good things good. So if you notice the way Socrates put this, put the point here, this is page 34 again, toward the bottom of the page, says, again, wealth does not bring about excellence. But excellence or virtue, remember, makes wealth and everything else good. So that's a strong claim here. There's one thing that's fundamentally good, and that's virtue. And things that are fundamentally, or as we say, intrinsically good, things that are good by their very nature, are things that make other things good. Okay. So philosophers have long been interested in what things are essentially or intrinsically good because those things explain why anything's good. They'll explain why even things that we don't consider to be good in themselves to be good, why they're good in the first place. Okay, so the example here would be virtue makes wealth good. How does that work? Well, when wealth contributes to someone attaining virtue, well then the wealth has a derived kind of goodness. It derives it from the virtue that it helped bring about. Okay. Um, and then note what he says here is, virtue, excellence again is the term that's used, makes wealth, and everything else that's going to be good. So, friendship, freedom, and any other thing that you identify, happiness, all these different things are going to be good in as much as they help one attain virtue. Okay. So the intrinsic good is virtue, and by attaining it, we make our lives better. All other good things, pleasure, happiness, money, success, etc., are only extrinsically good. Okay, to be extrinsically good means that that the kind of good thing you are is derivative from something that's intrinsically good. Okay, it's good because it helps bring about something that is more valuable. Okay, so if it's helpful, thinking about it, intrinsically good things as things that are internally or by their nature good, and extrinsic goods are things that aren't good internally or by their very nature, but get their goodness from something else. So the money example was maybe the easiest one to think about, at least initially. Money is something that we would consider to be good, at least sometimes. When is it good? It's good when it brings about, according to Socrates, virtue, when it brings about something else that's more fundamentally good. So that's why we call money an extrinsic good, as opposed to an intrinsic one. So that's Socrates' theory of the good. We're going to look at Aristotle's theory of the good later in the course, a bit later in the course, and also Epicurus's. So we'll come back to this issue. So if there's any questions you have, again, let me know them. But we will be coming back to this idea of the theory of a theory of goodness moving forward. So now Socrates on the unexamined life. So many of you have likely heard about Socrates' claim that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that happens a bit later in the text. Might not have it underlined or marked. Don't remember if I do. I don't have my, oh yeah, right here. I don't have my marked up text in front of me. I left that in my office on campus, but here's here on page 41, the second full paragraph where Socrates discusses that. Again, just point your attention to that. And some people, many of my students, at least when they read this and talk to me about it, they tend to think that what Socrates is claiming is that we should just examine our life for the sake of examining it. So reflect for the sake of reflection. But that's not what Socrates means. What he means is that unless we're examining our values to see whether they align with living a virtuous life, our lives aren't worth living. Perhaps another way of thinking about it is that what makes our lives properly human and not, say, animalistic, you might, yeah, if I could put it that way, not the life that an animal has, is that humans aim for something noble like virtue, as opposed to just a moment-to-moment pleasure or something like that, short-term pleasure gain. So a life where we weren't concerned with valuing and prioritizing virtue in our life would be one that's akin to living like an animal would live. But for a human being, that life really isn't befitting. And so that life just really isn't worth living for us. Okay. So we have to be clear here that when Socrates claims that the unexamined life is not worth living, he's not just saying it's examination for the sake of examination. Rather, it's a claim that we examine for the sake of 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 seeing whether or not our values, our personal values, line up with objectively valuable things, or the objectively valuable thing, because Socrates claims that there's one thing that is most valuable, that is a source of all value and all goodness, and that is virtue, living a virtuous life. So that means things like living a wise life, a just life, a courageous life, a temperate life, an honest life, okay, a generous life, a kind life, and these kinds of things, a hospitable life. Okay. Okay. So we think about like living a virtuous life, that usually means that it's something like we have developed the character traits that means that these things just flow from us. Okay. And of course, you can't have wisdom without having truth. You're wise about what's true. Okay. Again, think about courage, right? That means appropriately responding to fear, right? Where that flows from you such that you act even when you're in a state of fear, but you don't act in a rash way, but you act just the right kind of way with respect to fear. You act just, you give other people what they deserve and what they're owed. And that just flows from you, as it were, because you've developed the relevant character traits by practicing, practicing, practicing. At least that's a common way of understanding how virtue gets instilled in us. We practice, practice, practice such that our character is formed to respond to our world in terms of our feelings and our actions in the right kinds of ways, in the right kinds of moments, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And we'll talk a bit more about this habitual point about virtue when we talk about Aristotle, and a bit more when we get to Epicurus, as it turns out. Okay, so prioritize virtue. Examine your life to see whether or not you are really prioritizing being a healthy, excellent soul, person, etc. Okay, so lastly, under the key themes here, I want to talk about Socrates' theory of death. So we're going to talk about Epicurus' theory of death soon, so I want to give you Socrates's. Socrates' focus is going to be on whether or not it's rational to fear death. Part of Epicurus' focus on death is that as well. But see, they're going to give the same answer, but use different arguments to arrive at their answer. So they're both going to say that's irrational to fear death. In other words, we shouldn't fear death. Okay, but why does Socrates claim that that's so? He claims that that's so because we don't know what happens when we die. We don't know what death brings for us. This is interesting because typically people cite their fear of death based on their lack of knowledge. So he turns that argument on its head. This is another interesting point, as Socrates, as we've learned from the human wisdom story and from thinking about the Euthyphro and Socratic ignorance, Socrates claims that he doesn't have the relevant knowledge or wisdom. He claims that human wisdom is quite insignificant. Being humanly wise means knowing that one doesn't have the relevant philosophical wisdom. Um, um, Being humanly wise means that you recognize that only the gods have it, perhaps. I think that's Socrates' personal view. But Socrates claims that one of the ways that he's wiser than most, one of the reasons why Socrates belongs to the group of people who are such that none are wiser than they, is that he recognizes that we shouldn't fear death because we don't know what death brings for us. Socrates claims that there are many who think that death is a great evil, but they believe that without sufficient evidence, without sufficient thinking about the topic. They cite the lack of knowledge about what happens when we die. But Socrates says we can turn that argument on its head, so that precisely it gives us precisely the reason not to fear it. Okay. So, Socrates, just to say one last thing here about that human wisdom story that you're going to come across is, when Socrates' friend Chaerephon comes back to him and says, "Hey, the oracle says that there's none wiser than you." Socrates wants to interpret the oracle as saying that Socrates is one among perhaps many who come to realize that they don't have the relevant philosophical knowledge, and it's that makes Socrates wiser than others, and it's also going to be what makes others who also recognize this wiser than others. So the way I read the text is that Socrates is claiming that he's really just tied for the wisest. He's tied for the wisest with those who have the same kind of, you might say, humility with respect to what they know. Okay, they're aware of their knowledge limitations. Okay. So now just some concluding thoughts here. So Socrates, he makes several final points after he learns about his penalty, death penalty. So he's going to be capitally punished by way of drinking hemlock. He says being killed won't bring him harm. So he tends to think that being killed means being made physically dead. It's so he understands killing as entailing dying or death, but death is just physical death. The soul is going to go on. So killing him doesn't harm him because he is the thing that goes on. So there's this view that Socrates has that seems to be presupposed in the text that that he's not his body, okay, but he's the soul, and the soul is what's going to go on and continue existing, even though he doesn't know what's going to happen. It could be like a dreamless sleep, or it could be such that he continues practicing philosophy and hanging out with great poets and the like in the afterlife. Okay, those are a couple of possibilities he canvasses, claiming not to know which possibility is true. So being killed won't bring him any harm. So even if you weren't to have been killed, if you were to have been banished or disenfranchised, maybe you couldn't vote or something like that. that wouldn't have harmed either, because these are just sort of earthly physical harms, not soul harms. And Socrates thinks that the only way that you can be harmed, like the only way he could be harmed, is if his soul were harmed. The only way that I could be harmed or you could be harmed is if your soul is harmed. And how is your soul harmed? You're made corrupt, you're made more vicious, you're made wicked. Okay. And Socrates claims that that the good person, the person who strives to live a virtuous life, the person who's living the unexamined life and doing so in the right kind of way, is someone the gods will look out for, and the gods will protect you from the vice and the wickedness. Okay, so again, this is where we see some theology, more religion built into Socrates' philosophical worldview. And two, his followers will keep his message alive. I note this one because he also does claim that those who indicted him and those who convicted him in the jury, those who found him guilty and all the rest, like they're to blame. But he does claim this, his followers will keep his message alive. So he's not concerned with his message of being lost. And we can say this now, can't we? Here we are, 2025. This was 2,500 years ago, roughly, and we're still talking about Socrates' life. Now, the apology isn't a transcript of what happened at Socrates' trial. It's Plato's fictional work, maybe capturing the spirit of what happened at the trial to some degree, giving us a sense who Socrates was, what he wasn't, what kind of philosopher he was, and the like. Um, but still, like Plato wrote about Socrates, and it has withstood the test of time, withstood the test of philosophical time. Okay, so when Socrates claims that his followers would keep his message alive, he wasn't kidding. Okay, he was right. That was a prophecy that came true. And then he concludes after arranging for his kids to be taken, or asking for arrangements for his kids to be taken care of, which is kind of interesting because here he is at 70 years old on trial in Athens, yet he has children who need taken care of. Okay, I'll set that aside. He writes, he says, those present at the trial will go on to live. So members of the jury and all other observers are going to go on to live. Well, he goes to die. Um, um, but he claims nobody knows who has a better future. Only the God knows. So nobody human knows, nobody earthly knows, but the gods know. And that's the concluding thought. Okay, so now in the course, we're going to turn our attention, if I'm right, to Plato's Meno. And there we'll do something similar to what we did here with the Apologies. We'll do some summary work with some of the key summary moves in the text, and then we'll focus on a few key topics like we did here. And those topics are going to be related to thinking about what virtue is and its relationship to knowledge or wisdom, kind of knowledge. So that discussion, the connection between virtue and knowledge, so we try to understand virtue in terms of knowledge, takes place in the second half of the dialogue, if you wanted to give special attention to that while you're reading the text. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. I'm going to sign off and wish you all well. Be sure to be in touch with any questions you have at anything that I've said. I'm happy to clarify. Take care and have a good one. Bye-bye.